Hello everybody and welcome back. Thanks so much for tuning in. My name is Christian Skoggs, and I think it's safe to say that the best movie of 2024 so far is Dune Part 2. And given the overall reactions we've seen to this movie, chances are it's your favorite as well. It's made over $700 million at the box office as of this recording, with around 20% of the gross coming from IMAX screens. Now, I still remember when I saw the first Dune movie in theaters. It was an IMAX screening I went to, and it wasn't like the regular IMAX that you see at your local mall. This was the full, real deal, big screen 1.43:1 dual laser experience. I was already fascinated by this technology by the time Dune came out, but something about the way this movie specifically used it undoubtedly rewired my brain forever. I also found the storytelling to be both sophisticated and entertaining at the same time. Not since Lord of the Rings has a world felt so lived in, with so much lore that's extremely interesting to learn about. These two movies are also nothing short of a visual marvel. They're some of the best sci-fi movies of the 21st century. And if we're throwing out hot takes, I fully believe the first movie should have won Best Picture at the Oscars over Coda. It is unclear if the Oscars will make the same mistake with Part 2, but we'll see when March comes around. I don't know. When the show times for Dune Part 2 dropped and tickets went on sale, the hot tickets were the IMAX 70mm screenings. Although a Collider article had previously confirmed months ago that these screenings would be taking place, it was still very exciting to see. At the time, AMC CityWalk servers had crashed seemingly due to the demand that fans had to see this movie in that format. The film would continue to play in IMAX 70mm locations, while other films like Godzilla x Kong and Civil War were taking up the rest of the IMAX screens in the country. A similar thing happened when Oppenheimer was released. That movie ended up running for over 2 months in IMAX 70mm, including re-release screenings that they did around the time the Oscar nominations were announced. What I guess shocked me though was the fact that the servers for one theater crashed as a result of insane demand for a particular format that only this one theater out of like 12 in the world could show the movie on. I think people thought 3D was cool when they saw Avatar back in 2009, but I don't think there was ever a demand for 3D showings on the level that we're seeing demand for IMAX 70mm showings. So now this begs the question, will IMAX 70mm be the next big thing, and is it possible that the number of theaters capable of showing this format will grow? I guess to cut to the chase and answer the question right out the gate, I don't know. But in this video, I would like to make an argument for IMAX 70mm and look at what it would take for IMAX as a brand to expand this format to theaters nationwide. Let's start from the beginning. What is IMAX? IMAX is a large format cinema presentation with the goal of engulfing a viewer completely into a movie screen. A few things that make IMAX stand out in their efforts to achieve this goal is to have a tall aspect ratio of either 1.43:1 or 1.90:1. And the projection of these presentations is usually either done digitally, with laser projection, or on 70mm film. IMAX 70mm is the original version of IMAX that has existed ever since its birth in 1967, when it was developed by Canadian filmmakers Graeme Ferguson and Roman Croytor, who partnered with businessmen Robert Kerr and William C. Shaw. This was the next step in the line of film formats pitched to audiences, all with the intention of providing a big screen experience. Examples of past formats used include Fox Grandeur, VistaVision, and CinemaScope, aka Cinerama. IMAX was originally known as multi-screen, and it originally took a page out of CinemaScope's book in that it used multiple projectors at one time. Whereas CinemaScope was projected as one image on a widescreen with an aspect ratio of 2.70:1, IMAX was multiple separate images on a 1.43:1 screen. Sometimes this was a dome screen that was used, but the display was always similar in size regardless. The first movies shown by the company were experimental multi-screen experiences, one of which was a film called In the Labyrinth, directed by one of IMAX's co-founders, Roman Croytor. This film premiered at the Montreal Expo in 1967, and as you can see, it's literally multiple images being projected onto the screen at once. Sometimes the images overlap with one another to make a whole scene, sometimes separate scenes are depicted in each image. Either way, the presentation is meant to symbolize a labyrinth that the subject, who symbolizes the ancient Greek hero Theseus, in each of these sequences is meant to overcome. Now, this is a film that is overwhelming to watch, and I surely could only imagine what audiences were thinking when they saw this back in 1967 for the first time. Unfortunately, the film ran into technical issues and it was deemed a failure. I'm glad this movie does still exist and is available to watch on YouTube though. From what I understand, the other movie shown, The Man in the Polar Regions, is not available online. For all I know, this movie is lost media. I found an image online that somewhat describes what I imagine the experience was probably like, but I have no idea if the actual movie is available for viewing or not. Lost media forums ought to get on this one. The first official IMAX movie ever shown was in 1970 with the release of Tiger Child, which was similarly a multi-screen sensory experience on a dome interior. This premiered in Osaka, Japan at Expo 70, and by this time the founders were really able to figure out this IMAX technology that they had been cooking up for the last 3 years or so. Before you knew it, theaters in Ontario, Canada, San Diego, California, and Spokane, Washington were all starting to open up, and they were only showing short experimental documentaries. By 1976, the film To Fly had premiered. This is the earliest version of the IMAX documentary that we know of today. It plays out as a docudrama with a lot of impressive cinematography and imagery, all related to the technical marvel of flying. To Fly was actually the highest grossing documentary of all time after being shown in several museums for over 20 years, although that title was eventually dethroned by Fahrenheit 9/11 in 2004. By the end of its run, it made an estimated $135 million. To give you an idea of how big that is, Madam Web and Shazam! Fury of the Gods both made less money than that. Technically, To Fly is the second highest grossing film of 1976, behind Rocky. It's clear by this time that IMAX had really figured out a good system, and they began showing more and more documentaries in their theaters. It's what they were known for. Further, most of the IMAX theaters that had been built up until this point had been in science museums, like the Reuben H. Fleet Science Center at Balboa Park in San Diego, or the National Space and Air Museum at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. The first experience I ever had with IMAX was at the California Science Center in downtown Los Angeles. It wasn't until around the late 90s and early 2000s when blockbuster films began to be shown in IMAX theaters, and these theaters were built at multiplexes. Some of the earliest examples of IMAX auditoriums being built at these theaters were for AMC Lincoln Square, which opened on November 18, 1994, Regal Irvine Spectrum, which opened on March 15, 1996, and Universal City Walk, which opened on April 14, 2000. Some of the earliest blockbusters shown at these theaters included Fantasia 2000, Star Wars Episode II Attack of the Clones, Treasure Planet, and the two Matrix sequels. It's interesting going through the charts here on Wikipedia for early films released in IMAX and realizing that many of the aspect ratios were cropped to fit the screen, or that end credits would oftentimes be taken out of movies to fit the platter. By this time, IMAX was still a very experimental technology, so it was definitely a huge privilege to have easy access to one of these theaters for blockbuster entertainment. Then the year 2008 rolls around, and it was a big one for IMAX due to a little movie that came out called The Dark Knight. The Dark Knight, directed by Christopher Nolan, was the first blockbuster ever to shoot select scenes using IMAX cameras. If you're wondering why they didn't just shoot the whole movie using these cameras, there's a few reasons for this. First, they're noisy, and not great for getting dialogue. I mean, take a listen to how they sound. The second is that on top of being giant pieces of tech, they can only shoot about 30 seconds of footage at a time. You don't have a lot of time to work with these shots. And the third is the cost of these cameras. It's expensive to develop the film on these cameras, and it's expensive to rent them. They're valued at around $500,000 a piece, so one could only imagine that renting them for a 6-month shoot is probably not the move if you're a producer on a project. Regardless, it was still a massive success and generated a lot of hype to the IMAX format. It was also around 2007-2008 where digital IMAX auditoriums were beginning to be regularly installed at many theaters. Before you knew it, it wasn't just bougie theaters in New York or Hollywood or your local science museums that held IMAX screens anymore. There was now a good chance starting in the late 2000s and early 2010s that your local multiplex may have had an IMAX screen at it. Here's where things begin to get tricky though. Up until this point, all the IMAX screens I've referenced, the science museums, New York, Hollywood, All of these were true, genuine IMAX screens. They stood at an average of 75 feet tall and 50 feet wide, and more importantly, were always presented on their exclusive 70mm formatted film. Now, the IMAX screens that were being developed at your local mall were not that. You see, IMAX began to realize that it was best for business to expand their auditoriums into more multiplexes, but the reality is the majority of multiplexes do not have the infrastructure or budget to build a genuine IMAX auditorium at each location. As a result, the screens we got were smaller and retrofitted to fill the wall of the largest auditorium in a multiplex. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad way to view a movie, and I've had some really great experiences watching movies on these types of screens, but you gotta imagine that when people think of IMAX and they hear that an IMAX is coming to their local multiplex, their past experiences at, say, the science museums would get them to generate expectations that the experience would fall more in line with that. And to add more salt in the wound, the projection technology was now digital instead of 70mm film, and the aspect ratio was now 1.90 to 1 instead of the original 1.43 to 1. If you're wondering what 1.90 to 1 looks like, it's the aspect ratio you're watching this video on now. And if you're thinking this mostly looks like 16:9, yeah, most people would agree with you. Although, if you were to retrofit IMAX's 1.43 to 1 aspect ratio, it would mostly look like 4:3. The main difference comes in the resolution of the image. Now, generally, for digital and laser IMAX, you're going to find that presentations will usually come in at 4K. Not to discredit digital and laser IMAX, but the reality is you can recreate the resolution and aspect ratio pretty easily at home. To be fair, there are more specific steps taken in the DMR process of an IMAX release aside from upgrading resolution of a file, but I can't help but imagine you could probably pull it off pretty easily if you wanted to. Now, IMAX 70mm is a different story. The first thing you need to know about IMAX 70mm is that the resolution of an IMAX frame is 18K. The physical frame on a film strip is also significantly bigger than that of a 35mm or 70mm frame. If you were to pay attention to the perforation count on a frame of film, that being the little holes on the edge of the film, there's 4 perforations on a 35mm frame, 5 on an average 70mm frame, and 15 on an IMAX 70mm frame. The reason these perforations are important to know is that it gives a perspective of the size of the frame and how big it can be projected onto a screen. 35mm and 70mm frames can be projected onto a regular screen at a regular multiplex, while IMAX film is so big that it can only be properly projected onto a giant screen. Even if you were to look at a physical IMAX film strip like this one I have for Oppenheimer, you can see that the frame is so big, it's essentially like looking at little pictures. They're big enough to have as a picture on your fridge. It's been 16 years since the release of The Dark Knight, and most people are becoming more familiar with the different types of IMAX screens that are out there. It also appears as if demand for the superior IMAX 70mm presentation has grown, as Oppenheimer and Dune Part 2 were both massive successes in the format. It has also been announced that Joker Folie à Deux will receive an IMAX 70mm release, and that Interstellar is coming back in the format. So the question now remains, how will IMAX respond to this demand? Will they expand the format to be more readily available at your local theater? While it's possible, and I personally am hopeful that IMAX 70mm prints of upcoming movies will become more commonplace at the theaters that are capable of showing it, chances are that the format will probably not expand into your local marketplace. The reality is, IMAX has around 1,700 theaters around the world, and there's realistically no way that prints could be made for every single theater to show a film in the format. And further, the screen sizes that most IMAX theaters have at the local multiplexes wouldn't even be capable of showing IMAX 70mm even if they wanted to. Now, we have seen an example of an IMAX venue with a 1.90 to 1 screen being retrofitted to show IMAX 70mm, and that would be the TCL Chinese Theater. This place is great, and has the best 1.90 to 1 IMAX screen I've personally ever seen. In order to make the IMAX 70mm presentation work on that screen though, they had to retrofit it to fill the aspect ratio. The screen at this venue is smaller than your average Chinese theater viewing, but you're getting more aspect ratio out of it. The other reason they're capable of showing it is because it is a big screen at 46 feet tall and 94 feet wide. Plus, add to the fact that the Chinese theater is a huge venue, and you could retrofit the IMAX 70mm frame onto the screen pretty easily. Even with that though, they still have to take off a good chunk of the seats in the back in order to place a projector. In order to make IMAX 70mm work at your local multiplex, the company would have to figure out a few things. 1. Can you develop an IMAX film strip that can fit a smaller screen without compromising quality? 2. Can you mass produce the film strip for theaters around the world? 3. Can you install projectors that can project these smaller IMAX 70mm film strips across the world? And 4, and most importantly, can all this be done at a reasonable price, and can IMAX in turn expect a profit off what would be a very risky investment? The reality is, as much as film buffs would love to see something like this happen, it's probably not going to happen for a while. Oppenheimer did in fact almost make $1 billion, in part due to the demand of the IMAX 70mm screenings that persisted for over 2 months. But if we're being honest, those numbers would need to go up for IMAX to want to do something about that. They'd probably want to see over $1 billion at the box office, and 5 months of IMAX 70mm screenings instead of 2. Again, not that 2 months isn't impressive, but it needs to be something that IMAX can look at and really acknowledge as a lucrative cash cow for them. You know, for film fans and people who care about these kinds of presentations, yeah, these screenings are going to be really popular. But like, is your coworker at your office job who maybe watches like 2 movies a year gonna care that your local mall down the street is showing the newest movie in an all-new retrofitted IMAX 70mm experience? Probably not. The reason IMAX developed smaller digital auditoriums to begin with was that the technology was easy to replicate and actually offered them a lucrative cash cow for the time being. They especially served the public well when 3D was really popping off, and IMAX 3D was all the rage for the first half of the 2010s. So overall, I personally would love to see more movies in IMAX 70mm. I think it's my favorite way to see a movie behind IMAX 3D at number 2, and I can fully say that I've never had a bad experience with an IMAX 70mm presentation. But unless it can be easily spread and profited off of, it's not going to happen. Whether studios decide to expand the format for more movies at the locations that can handle it, we have yet to see. I personally think that will happen, and we're already seeing this a bit as, again, Interstellar is coming back in the format, and Joker 2 is coming out, both later this year. But yeah, honestly, it's a very exciting time for IMAX fans to be living in right now. While I think this year is going to be really lame for new movies for the most part, it could be IMAX's year to showcase both old and new movies in the format. And look, if they're successful at getting mainstream audiences excited about the format, you never know what could be coming next. Let me know what your thoughts are if you went to an IMAX 70mm experience. Did you enjoy it? And what was it like getting tickets to see your movie in that format? Hope you're all doing okay out there though, and until next time.